Hello and welcome back to Storytime with Alex, reading the story from Allbyon to Britannia, Book 1, The Witches of Old Allbyon by Brandy Pearson. This is part 2 of The Witch and the Worm. In the first part, Mistress Anne Morrow has come to a village where a great worm has wrapped itself all around the church. No one could get in to celebrate Christmas, and if anyone sings it starts howling. And they've gone to the wizard's tower nearby, but he appears to have been eaten, but left his house just completely unlocked and open. So there is a bit of a mystery going on. Let's find out what happens. 5. Oh Morning Star. Anne woke early the next day, while the stars still lingered in the sky, determined to try out an idea that had been forming in her head, before Davy Lock tried out his sword and possibly lost his life. She crept out of the inn and made her way towards the church. She edged past the worm's tail through the lich gate and followed the worm's body to its head at the church door. It seemed to be asleep, but opened its ruby red eyes as she drew near. "Good morning, Master Worm. I am Anne Morrow, a wandering witch. I bear you no ill will, especially in these Advent days when we await the coming of the Christ child at Christmas." The worm looked mournfully at her and started to whimper. "I hope you will not mind if I sing a harmless little spell, just to understand a little better what is going on." Before it had time to object, she hummed her disclosing spell and fluttered her hands. Slim tendrils of magic grew from her fingers and curled around the worm's head, and then continued to grow all around and down his body, all the way to his tail. She was about to talk to the worm again, when she heard a clanking noise. Davy Lock was approaching the lich gate, waving his sword and wearing a fair copy of a breastplate and helmet. "Oh no!" Anne cried. "Master Worm, keep calm. I think I know what has happened, but for now I have to stop Davy Lock from being ridiculously brave. Please don't hurt him." Anne ran down the hill, clambering over the worm, and managed to get to the gate before Davy could get close enough to the worm to make a swing with his sword. "Davy Lock," she cried, "you're a brave man, but this is not the answer. I don't think this beast means any harm, because I believe he is no beast at all. I think this worm is your wizard, fallen victim to a spell gone awry." She heard the worm whimper again, and it thumped its tail and nearly demolished the lich gate. "All we need to do now is find a way of undoing his own spell." Later, she realised she should have got all the villagers together before explaining what she had worked out. As it was, she explained it half a dozen times, first to Davy Lock, then to Joan and Jim at the inn over breakfast, and then to others as the news got around. She could see the wizard in her imagination. He had been sitting at his desk, reading a transformation spell. He must have glanced at himself in the mirror and accidentally set the spell in motion. Through his reflection in the mirror it had bounced back onto himself and had been transformed into the image in his mind, the worm in the illuminated borders of the page of his spell book. Such a spell takes a while to take hold, and he had dashed out of the tower in search of help. Perhaps he had seen his drawing of the church, or perhaps he had hoped that the spell would not take hold in a church. The spell had overtaken him on the way, fuddling his mind and leaving him with just one thought: to get to the church. By the time he reached the church door, transformed into a worm, the only thought he had left was to get to the church. There he had gone, and there he had stayed. All she needed to do now was to find out how to reverse the spell. She heard herself tell the villagers with confidence that she would work out what to do, but in her heart she was not so sure. 6. O King of the Nations. She spent the night running over what she had discovered in her mind, searching for a way to undo a wizard's spell, when the wizard was unable to do it himself. She tried to remember everything she knew about wizard's magic. She remembered a particularly annoying wizard holding forth about wizard's magic bringing light to the world, while witches' magic obscured the world like smoke. Eventually she fell asleep and dreamed of all those words marching across the pages of the wizard's book in straight lines and shining out like a bright light. When she awoke, an idea had been born. When morning came, she ate a good breakfast. Then, after asking about, she borrowed a donkey and a couple of sacks from Tom the woodcutter. Davy Lock was still looking wistfully at the sword he had made, so she asked him to come with her to help him out of trouble, to keep him out of trouble, and they returned to the wizard's tower. Up in the wizard's study she made sure a ribbon marked the page, and, with her gloves on, she shut the book of spells and carefully put it into one of the sacks. She tried to get the mirror off the wall, but it was fixed tight. But she found another smaller mirror in the wizard's bedroom, clearly where he trimmed his beard and twizzled his moustaches. That would have to do, so she wrapped it up in one of the wizard's spare robes and took that mirror in the other sack. She hung the 2 sacks across the donkey's back, and they returned to the village, where Davy helped carry them up the hill to the head of the Wurm. Then she got him to go and bring her some cut logs. He returned later with a handcart full of them. She hung the mirror from a handy nail inside the church porch, where the Wurm could see himself with his ruby eyes. He started to wail when he saw his reflection, which she took as a good sign. Somewhere inside the Wurm, the wizard was still there as she had hoped. The next part was much trickier. Using some of the logs, she arranged the book of spells so that the Wurm could see it through the mirror. As she gingerly opened the book to the page with the transformation spell, it kept trying to turn its head and look at the book directly, but she shook her head and firmly told it to look in the mirror. Then she took a deep breath and sang her own little spell. "Wizard, awaken and see what thou hast done to thee." It was a tiny spell, which curled around and into the Wurm's ruby eyes like a wisp of frankincense. She dared do no more. Now it was up to the wizard himself. She realised the villagers were all standing at the foot of the hill, and she hoped they would come no nearer. Mixing different kinds of magic could sometimes have an explosive effect. At first she thought that nothing was happening at all, but very gradually she saw that the Wurm's eyes were beginning to glow like lanterns. Brighter and brighter they glowed, like red-hot charcoal. This was not her magic, but it was too bright and showy. Suddenly, red beams of light shot from the Wurm's eyes. They hit the mirror and bounced onto the book of spells. For a moment she was worried that the book would catch fire. Then she heard a voice, not in the outer world, but in her head. It must be the wizard's thoughts, but they made no sense. Had being turned into a worm scrambled his brains entirely? Then she realised that the words were like mirror words, backwards. Originally he had spoken the spell to himself and set it going by seeing himself in the mirror. Now he was seeing himself in the mirror and speaking the spell backwards. Slowly the Wurm became insubstantial, and another form, that of the wizard, grew in its place. The villagers gasped, and Anne stood out of the way, still unsure that this was working rightly. There was a sudden bang, and the Wurm was gone, and in its place a naked and very embarrassed wizard. Anne reached into the sack and gave him the robe she'd bought from his tower. She was extremely happy to have bought it. 7. O Emmanuel. Even fully clothed, the wizard was embarrassed. He had been a fool to speak the words of the spell, even in his head. He had been a bigger fool to be distracted by the mirror and looked at himself while speaking the words of the spell. He had upset and annoyed the villagers, who had always been very hospitable to him, and worst of all, he had been rescued from his own spell by a witch. Anne had been right. He had been leafing through his book of spells before coming to church, trying to find something suitable for the Christmas festivities, turning a pebble into a plum pudding or some such. He had not been concentrating, enjoying the fine illuminated border and glancing at himself in the mirror. He had just trimmed his beard and moustache and had been admiring the effect. When he realised what he had done, he tried to undo the spell, but had been so flustered that nothing seemed to stop it. He had indeed run towards the church because the spell would not have been able to take hold there, but he was much too late. The villagers were being so kind to him that he looked as though he might burst into tears. Anne told him that the wizard needed to get back to his tower for a lie-down. He gave her a grateful look and retreated. The next morning the villagers came out of their cottages to find that the Christmas crib had been erected on the village green. The wizard had got up very early to get it done himself. As they came out to see it, it began to snow. He'd always been good at weather spells. Later in the day, as twilight fell, the wizard provided them with beautiful floating lights like thistledown, so that they had light to sing and dance their carols, and Anne Morrow made a steaming bowl of mulled ale, and a huge pile of mince pies to round off the evening. 8. Christmas Eve. On Christmas Eve the wizard tramped all the way to the monastery by the sea to explain what had happened to the monks, apologise to Father Francis, and bring him back to the village. Father Francis was also a little embarrassed, both because he had run away and abandoned the villagers, and because the whole problem had been solved by a witch. But he said sorry to everyone and shook Anne Morrow's hand. As dusk fell, he led the whole village in evening prayer, and they sang the song of the O antiphons to make up for what they had missed. Just before midnight, the villagers made their way up the hill to St. Michael's for midnight mass of the Nativity, and Father Francis insisted that Anne Morrow take part in the procession to the crib on the village green. He gave her the model of the baby Jesus to hold, and she laid him in the manger. She could scarcely see what she was doing because of the tears of joy in her eyes. She hoped no one else had noticed, but when she looked surreptitiously around, she realised that she was not the only one. The end. I hope you enjoyed that little festive tale. I know it's May, but, whatever. Do come back next time for the story of the Tale of the Wizard's Boot.